Good evening. It's thrilling to see so many of you here this evening for what is going to be a very exciting discussion, I'm sure, and I think it will be a very enlightening discussion. And I'd like to thank the 92nd Street Y and Bob Gilson in particular. It was about 1 year ago when we bumped into each other near here, and he said, "What's up? And would you like to do something at the 92nd Street Y? What is the hot topic in museums these days?" And I said, technology, technology, technology. It's hitting us all like a tidal wave, and it's very exciting. And so here, a year later, I'm thrilled that he followed up, and we have a stellar lineup of speakers this evening. During my 30-year career in museums, there have been three game-changing moments. In the early 80s, it was the introduction of the blockbuster in museums, and museums started to suddenly pay attention to audience attendance. I remember my first meeting when the audience was suddenly a major topic. Second of all was in the mid-80s with the introduction of the computer in museums, and like many other places in our society, it was a galvanizing force, it was a centralizing force, it really broke down the silos, the fiefdoms that had existed in museums for so many years, and really started to centralize and standardize a lot of our procedures. And then the most recent one was the role of digital and social media as a central part of the visitor experiences in museums. And this is what every museum today is really trying to grapple with, how to incorporate it. Today, technology is giving museums an opportunity to reframe who they are and re-envision what they want to be. And at the center of this is the visitor. Museums are engaging with visitors, turning from what were traditionally exclusive places to inclusive places, moving the visitor from a passive observer to an active participant in the museum's experience. This is a major paradigm shift. And what challenges does this pose for the museum? And how will the current relations between museums and their communities change? And what is the role of the future? So as Bob said, gave you the format for this evening's presentation, and I would like to just say a few words about each of our stellar speakers. And I will list them in order of priority of presentation. Seb Chan is Director of Digital and Emerging Media at the Smithsonian's Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum in New York, where he is shaking up all things digital, I can tell you, and is responsible for the museum's complete digital renewal and reimagining. Previously based at the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, he is known for his expertise in open access, mass network collaboration, digital strategy, cultural sector metrics, and cultivating innovation in the cultural sector. He has worked as a consultant for museums and libraries worldwide, helping them adapt and change to the digital age. He was a member of the Australian government's 2.0 task force and currently serves on several nonprofit advisory boards. He has a former life writing an abandoned PhD, I haven't heard about that yet, as a festival and event organizer in new electronic arts, and founded Cyclic Defrost magazine. He blogs at freshandnew.org, that's freshandnew.org, and enjoys a sweet botrytis after dinner. Jake Barton will be the second speaker. Jake is principal and founder at Local Projects, the world's leading media design firm for museums and public spaces. Local Projects is a media designer for the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum with Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, and Gallery 1 at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is a spectacular new installation, which I'm sure Jack will be telling you about this evening. Local Projects is a 3-time National Design Award finalist and was named #2 of the top 10 most innovative design firms by Fast Company magazine for its redefinition of emotional storytelling. Between StoryCorps and the 9/11 Memorial Museum, they have gathered over 100,000 individual stories and memories, sharing them with the world and touching millions of lives. Current clients include the New Victory Theater, San Francisco MoMA, General Electric, Microsoft, Johnson & Johnson, New York Hall of Science, and the Gates Foundation. Our third speaker is Mark Robbins. The creative work of Mark Robbins bridges the fields of art and architecture, encompassing photography, installations, and site-specific projects. Robbins is currently the executive director of the International Center of Photography in New York, the preeminent museum and educational institution for the presentation and interpretation of the reproduced image. He was previously dean and professor at the Syracuse University School of Architecture and the university's senior advisor on architecture and urban initiatives. Robbins served as the director of design at the National Endowment for the Arts during the Clinton administration, where he developed an aggressive program to strengthen the presence of innovative design in the public realm, and was curator of architecture at the Wexner Center for the Arts from 1993 to 1999. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Seb Chan.
Thanks heaps, Cara, and hi. This is kind of, my laptop's gone to sleep, which it shouldn't have done, but that's all good. So yeah, as Cara said, I'm here in New York at the Cooper-Hewitt, which is a few blocks away. But I was at the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, which is a large design and science museum. What I'm sort of here at Cooper-Hewitt to do is to take the opportunity of rebuilding the museum. So this is what it looks kind of like now, as this opportunity to rethink the conventions of the museum and building in digital from the ground up. And unfortunately, I had hoped I could show you some of the cool secret things, but I can't, but Jake might, because we're working with local projects. But I think importantly in the museum world, Nick Poole, the CEO of the Collections Trust, had this beautiful quote that really museums have changed, and the core functional model of a museum now has expanded to incorporate publishing and broadcast as well as that physical locative experience. And so what does this mean for museums? Because museums are really storytelling machines, and as machines, technology is beginning to transform all the elements of their museum experience, from the visitor experience to the very things we collect. So I'm going to give a broad overview of some of the exciting things that are going on around the world, and then Jake will zoom in on a few particular things. Technology in museums isn't new. The first, the audio guide dates back to 1952 and looks surprisingly like the audio guides you get now on the iPhone. That's 60 years ago, yeah? But this is a new type of audio guide. This is one that actually is deployed in a museum in Tasmania, back home. This one senses where you are within the gallery and delivers content relevant to the works you stand in front of. What is exciting about this audio guide, it has given the opportunity for the museum to completely jettison wall kind of labels completely. So the way museums tell kind of these stories is beginning to change through technology. The other exciting thing about this is that it allows the museum to better track the things visitors really do, which are not the things that museums necessarily think visitors do. Also, we're seeing transformations in exhibit design, so museums are becoming more theatrical with their exhibits. This is a photography show at the Powerhouse where we were using mirrors to create an immersive but very simplistic sort of projected experience for a fashion show. Here's the Maritime Museum in the UK. This is an exhibit design which has no objects at all. This is an exhibit that was about climate kind of change, and they employed UVA to create this environment where visitors walked around with a UV torch to shine light on the melting polar caps and experience the desolation that results from this. It was an amazing experience, and it was very, very much communicated the effect of climate kind of change without being too sort of didactic around that. Also, we're seeing the presence now, the ubiquitous presence, particularly in science museums, but this is also flowing through to other museum types of the interactive table. Here's a quite beautiful example from Australia that had a whole series of these tables joined together as the centre point of an exhibit that allows stories to flow between visitors, and it was a really social experience. You'll see the snake that slithers across the everything's scary in Australia. In Australia, as you know. So that's within museums, and you'll hear Jake delve deeply around exhibit design. The network as well is allowing museums to tell stories that are native to the network itself or the internet. The Google Art Project allows us finally to navigate large bodies of work irrespective of the museum that holds kind of them. We're seeing the British Museum working with the BBC, and curiously BBC Radio here, to tell unique kind of stories about its own collection and to connect with regional radio across the UK to really engage local communities and small local volunteer-run museums around these sorts of stories too. We're seeing large-scale digitisation projects, particularly within Europe, although with the DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America, coming online here soon, we may get to this here. Europeana has started to explore ways of telling stories across thousands of museum, library and archival collections around themes. So the network allowing cross-museum, cross-repository stories to be told. There are also stories that can only be done with technology. So this is an amazing piece that is a digitisation of the Mogao grottos in China. I'll actually just play this with the audio, because this is an immersive 3D environment that allows visitors to explore the grotto in a way that isn't physically possible any other way.
The only light that's available is the torch of the guide that will accompany you through this experience. So your access to this cave is very limited, or the caves that you might go to. Also at Dongguan, and this is important to note, there is only 10 caves open to the public out of the full 700 that are there on site. So in the virtual world, of course, you can do anything you like, and you can light the world up. So this is one of the great benefits. All the medicine Buddhas have been recolored as they would originally have been. So this is an 18-step hand-painted process where each layer is scanned, and the scans are then recombined in the computer for this 2D animation layer. So it's quite extraordinary, the brightness compared to this, the original as it is today.
We're also at Cooper-Hewitt doing very simple uses of data analysis to do analysis of the colours within our collection that begins to sort of reveal new patterns and new ways of connecting collections, pieces within our collection. So here are all the objects in the shade of blue, or perhaps the shade of green. So this algorithmic approach to collections is creating new forms of curation and suggesting new forms of curation. We're also seeing the emergence of 3D scanning and 3D printing. So this is a 3D, this is a sculptural piece that's been 3D scanned, and here on a site called Thingiverse, you can in fact not only see this in 3D, this was done with consumer-grade pocket cameras. You can download the 3D model and print it at scale. So this is creating new ways of exploring and using collections. Not only that, and with 3D, but also 2D, we can take museum collections to the places where they make most sense. So the Powerhouse had a very large collection of historic photos, and here is a photo we found on Flickr of someone who had taken one of our photos and photographed themselves with it in a place where the photo was originally taken. So that's kind of meta, but you get the idea. But this idea that, in fact, seeing this image here gives it more meaning than seeing it stuck on a wall in a museum itself. In Rotterdam, the NAI in the Netherlands was using this to explore the archives that they have to look at the proposed buildings that were to be built within Rotterdam. So this was using the architectural models from their collection to simulate the way they would look within the city. We're also seeing innovations like from the Tate. The Tate has launched a really fun mobile app that basically looks at your surroundings, the temperature, the time of kind of day, your location, and then sends kind of you a work of art from their collection that matches that. It's very, very, very cute, but it's this sort of sense that now the museum's collection has a value beyond the walls. They also have a very cute ad for it. So this is nice because it's also a free app. One of the challenges, though, and this is all delivery-based stuff, is that now museums and memory institutions need to acquire things that are digitally born. So we've seen in recent kind of times the Library of Congress acquiring the archive of Twitter. So all of the tweets, how do those get collected and preserved? Interestingly, the library is struggling with providing a way for researchers to search the archive because it is so vast. So at Cooper-Hewitt, we're actually just been moving from a collection that in the past looked a little like this. This is a photo of the Cooper-Hewitt collection a long time ago. Here's a 3D printed chair that we acquired a few years ago, and we have just acquired a piece of software, software that we needed to acquire the source code for. So not only did we acquire the finished work as in the chair itself, but we have acquired the way of recreating it. You'll be hearing more about that in the future. Technology is not only a tool that we use, but it's a thing that begins to shape the type of collections that we have. So I'm just going to finish with some of the key tensions and challenges for museums, and these will become relevant in the discussion, is how do museums, particularly the smaller museums that are not large global brands like the Tate, the MoMA, the Met, deal with the pressures of scale? How kind of do we balance the needs of small local audiences and local communities with the opportunities of global reach? How do we adapt to new audiences, both local and global? How do we transform the collections we have so we collect the present as well as the past? How kind of do we find and retain the staff with the skills to embed these practices within the museum itself? How do we fund this? And how does technology in all of this begin to change the museum's mission, the core mission of the museum? So on that, I'll pass to Jake Barton. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Seb. So I'm really excited to be here, in particular to start with a comment that Cara made about the tidal wave of technology that's, I'm sure, crashing over all of us. And I feel oftentimes when I talk about technology, I talk about it like falling in love. Right? And the idea about falling in love is that it's this rush of newness, and there's all these new things you want to discover, these new opportunities, these ways. And even if you close your eyes and think about it, there's a sense of falling and changing. There's also a sense of a little bit of fear, of loss of control. So this, appropriately enough, is a picture of Venus passing. If you remember this summer, this was this sort of unprecedented moment for the solar system. And one reason was because we could capture it all in real time from satellites that were orbiting the Earth. And I actually got this picture sent, which was sent essentially from the sun to the satellite down to the studio where I work in New York, and then up actually to 30,000 feet above the Earth when I was on a plane. Right? And that is a categorically new moment. That's never happened before. Right? Like, that's one thing we need to understand about technology. And actually, within that same plane flight, this was sent to me. This is a 3D scanner which created a new dance performance, which is output in this 3D way. This is, yes, indeed, you're seeing it right. That sphere there actually is levitating. This is an interface made by the MIT Media Lab. And this is just in one day. People who deal with technology every day crashing over us like these tidal waves are these new opportunities that technology is affording us. And it reminded me of this quote from a neuroscientist that we're working at New York Hall of Science. When you discover something in the lab, you know that for that moment, you're the only person in the world who knows that piece of information. That's a very special condition. And for those of us working with technology, and in particular, I think designers, we have the chance to metabolize technology, to figure out how it can work for people. And in this case, we're talking about it for museums specifically. So in terms of the firm that I founded, that I lead, is Local Projects, and we make all sorts of different media installations for museums and for public spaces. This is a media sculpture that we built for a museum in Philadelphia, and a lot of our work deals with the sort of mixing of the physical and the digital, as you can imagine. This is a piece that we're building for the Eisenhower Memorial with Frank Gehry Partners. We do a lot of work with different architecture firms to tell stories in physical spaces. This is literally reading the bas-reliefs that will be in the memorial and actually bringing them to life, actually showing the moments when Eisenhower is actually talking to troops right before D-Day. This is a piece called Big Heart, which we built with the architect Bjarke Ingels in Times Square. So we're working in public art, architecture, and increasingly in corporate and hospitals in a lot of different contexts. In this case, what's happening is as people put their hand onto an interface, it actually makes the heart flash, the beating heart of New York City itself. This is a piece that we built for the BMW Guggenheim Lab, which really demonstrates the sort of range of audiences that we're dealing with. And in this case, you see a facilitator who's working with a mobile app, which is increasingly a technology base that we're working with to connect people together to the city of the future. And then we also make these types of immersive theater experiences. So our studio is a little unorthodox that we mix both linear as well as interactive media together. And in this case, it's telling the story of prominent Americans through people in the same field. So it's talking about Einstein as explained by physicists, by Michio Kaku. Or there's Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who talks about Justice Louis, I forgot his last name. Brandeis, thank you. Sorry, I'm thinking Louis Kahn. Louis Brandeis, or J.J. Abrams, explaining why Spielberg is such a fantastic director from a director's point of view. And so I'm going to talk to you just quickly about 3 different projects that we've put together that I think in some ways both advance the idea about technology, but also in some ways complicate it. So our first project that we created the interaction design for is StoryCorps, and it's a very simple project where you go into these soundproof booths, you interview someone, a loved one, a neighbor, you leave with a copy of the interview, and a copy also goes into the Library of Congress. So it's essentially a way to make a national oral histories project one conversation at a time. And the thing I like about it is that there's actually a lot of technology that made this project possible, but it was really an idea that was such a big innovation that actually facilitated all these different conversations. So these are a couple excerpts.
We took off, and as we were ascending, before we had leveled off, our level off point was 45,000 feet. So before we had leveled off, Pedro began leaving us. And the beauty about it is that I believe that there's something after life. You can see it in Pedro.
See, the thing of it is, I always feel guilty when I say I love you to you, and I say it so often. I say it to remind you that as dumpy as I am, it's coming from me. It's like hearing a beautiful song from a busted old radio. Yeah, well, and it's nice of you to keep the radio around the house.
So this is the ring that my father gave to my mother, and we can leave it there. And he saved up, and he purchased this, and he proposed to my mother with this. And so I thought that I would give it to you so that he could be with us for this also. So I'm going to share a mic with you right now, Deborah. Where's the right finger? Deborah, will you please marry me?
Yeah, of course. I love you.
So kids, this is how your mother and I got married. In a booth in Grand Central Station with my father's ring. My grandfather was a cab driver for 40 years, used to pick people up here every day. So it seems right.
So I once heard a blogger describe StoryCorps, which plays on NPR every week, as a conspiracy to make America cry every Friday morning. And part of it is because the interviews themselves are so incredibly warm, and really because they capture that humanity itself. And that is a lot of what our projects are interested in doing. We move from storytelling into legacy as one of the main things that we're interested in doing. And that idea of essentially building a platform for people to communicate with each other is at the core of the work that we're doing for the 9/11 Memorial Museum. So we're the media designers and did the original master plan and have worked on it now for 7 years, and the museum is slated to open next year. These are some of the construction shots in terms of different artifacts and how the museum is actually looking at this point as a piece of archaeology. But we actually began the engagement with this project called Make History. This we launched on the 8th anniversary, and it was essentially a worldwide call for photos, for videos, for stories about people's experiences on 9/11, and we overlaid these images of the past onto images of the present. So building out this archive was a way for the museum to both announce itself globally, to bring people into the story, and most of all to tell the story in a way that matches 9/11 itself, because of course 9/11 really happened to all of us as we experienced it. And we put that together with this story booth. It's really the simplest one we've ever built, where people just locate themselves on a map. It's in 6 languages, and people tell their stories of where they were on 9/11 itself in any language. And that actually becomes the core of the museum experience itself. Meaning when you first come into the museum, and this is the opening gallery, the first voice you hear is not a historian, it's not a curator, it's actually other visitors, exactly like you, telling and sharing their experiences exactly as they did on that day. So I'm going to go from here into some video that we made of a mock-up. And this will give you some sense of the experience itself.
September 11th, 2001.
On September 11th.
September 11th.
September 11th. September 11th.
I was in Honolulu, Hawaii.
I was in Cairo, Egypt.
Route des Champs-Élysées à Paris.
In college at UC Berkeley.
I was in Times Square.
São Paulo do Brasil.
Estava in Miami, Florida.
It was probably about 11 o'clock at night.
I was driving to work at 5:45 local time in the morning. We were actually in a meeting when someone barged in and said,
Oh my God, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center.
trying to frantically get to a radio.
When I heard it over the radio.
J'écoutais la radio.
And so I think it's a good sense of how people experienced that day and embodies it. So you don't need to actually tell the fact that this is a global event. You don't need to actually state the fact that a third of the world was literally watching this live on that day. You can embody that, and furthermore, you can make it a platform for people to participate, because visitors may not know it when they're walking through that gallery, but one of the final acts in the museum is actually telling your own story and adding it to the collection for the museum and telling it for other visitors to learn from you. So the last project I'm going to talk about is Gallery 1, which is at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And we had this mantra that we started to develop even as the work in our studio was sort of moving in a more participatory manner. They say if you're going to steal, you should steal from the best. This is from Confucius, from 500 BC. This is not a new idea. This is not technology speaking to us. But it does actually really speak, I think, to where we are today. The fact that humans learn by experiencing things is actually very, very old and very hardwired into the way that our brains work. In this case, Cleveland is at the tail end of a massive expansion, a $350 million expansion that's capped by a huge atrium that Raphael Vignoli designed. And in doing that, they had a board member that challenged them and said, you know, we're building all this new capacity. Let's talk about building new audiences. And so what they did was they engaged a series of different consultants around the idea of technology in galleries. We got involved at the tail end and sort of changed the whole approach because, ironically enough, as the new technology partner, we actually deleted about 80% of the actual technology in the galleries. And the reason was because and we feel really strongly that the traditional gallery model, the ways that art museums work, that capacity to meditate and to really think and commune with an artwork is the most important part of the art museum experience. And so what we did was we pulled the screens away from the actual artworks and didn't compete with them. We lowered them so you could see over them to the artworks, and we made everything in the screens themselves contingent on looking at the artworks. So these are just early mock-ups that we made of the technology, but you can imagine here, you can actually manipulate the artworks themselves, right? You can actually move them around, and everything is inquiry-based. This is my favorite. You can actually see the original context of the artwork. It's very, very simple, but placing that artwork in this actual location in Japan. And then furthermore, in this case, you can actually digitally sculpt a piece of clay to understand the way in which clay actually creates sculpture. This is another mock-up of an interface that actually allows you to draw, and when you're drawing, it's actually bringing forth objects from the collection with the same shape. So this came out of conversations with the curators where we said, you know, that's sort of weird about art museums, right? It's these cathedrals to creativity, but you don't get the chance to actually be creative yourself. And of course, drawing and making marks and making images is so fundamental to humanity. In this case, it becomes a dialogue between yourself and these incredible masters of their artworks. So I'll just show you an overview of the Gallery 1 experience, and it has a really broad array of different experiments, really, that sit together. So you can see here it really is designed like a traditional gallery. So there's all these different artworks. These are Picassos, these are Chacloses, these are incredible masterworks. And then a lot of the thinking in Gallery 1 permeates throughout the entire institution itself. So for example, in this case, you can see in its final installation, if you work with different individual artworks, you can manipulate them and see the original context. This interface allows people to make different faces and then bring forth artworks based on the images that they're making with their own face. So that's the collection of humanity and emotion that people can bring to the artworks themselves with this interface. This is the final installation of line work, which allows you to actually search the collection by drawing. We actually made it for kids, but it was so hilariously addictive. We have an adult version, which has information in it, so it made curators feel much more comfortable. But you can see here, just jumping into it. And this is an interface that allows you to remix this medieval tapestry, which tells the Perseus myth. So it allows you to take the chapters from the tapestry and actually turn it into a comic book or a film trailer. And then you can share that with other people. So it's a way to learn about the artworks themselves and make things and share things. In this case, it's a sculptural activity that is actually a figurative sculpture. So you're choosing different sculptures and trying to match them, right? And it has a hilarious rating system. And then you can email yourself pictures of yourself embodying these sculptures. Hilariously enough, we got complaints because we neglected to have that percentage in the email. People were mad they weren't getting credit. This piece is the sort of culmination of Gallery 1. It's a collections wall that has these different curatorial groups, so color and circles, top 50 favorites. You can access all 3,000 artworks that are on display all at the same time from this individual space. And what you're doing is basically looking at different collections that those individual items are part of, making new discoveries, making connections that you wouldn't, and making connections that the curators can't necessarily do with different hangs inside the galleries themselves. And then as you're clicking on individual artworks, you're saving it to an iPad. And what that allows you to do is take it throughout the museum and essentially custom curate your own tour to the museum. So you can take a tour from a guard or from your niece or from the director. And as you're making your way throughout the institution, you can both follow individual tours, or we have what's called Near You Now, which is a location-based service. So it'll tell you about any artwork that's surrounding you. It's just a way to stumble on it. Or this piece, which allows you to actually scan an artwork. You can see with image recognition, it's pointing things out to you as if the curator was there pointing out individual points of interest for you. So all these things are really overwhelming, right? There's all these new technologies that essentially we partnered and prototyped and workshopped with the museum and with the creative coders inside of our company to come up with. And we get all this data back, which is kind of amazing too. Just as a last thing to leave, in the midst of actually collecting all this data and finding out what people are looking at, we also just had a great time looking at all the actual images of people communing with the artworks themselves, right? And this, to me, hilariously enough, is what in some ways really complicates, I guess, even my own talk about how this is this rush of newness, because this moment of actually being able to make that human connection, being able to actually experience that empathy that comes from actually communing with an artwork, is really something very old and something very primal inside of all of us. And so I think in some ways, really what we're trying to do with technology is to make those connections even more human. And with that, I will thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mark. See, you're here.
God, it's amazing what the mind can produce. It's fantastic. So, what was so good to see in these last two presentations was really the kind of interaction between technology and a kind of seamless exchange between the physical thing and technology. So I'm going to start with history, which is where I often start. And thinking about these questions about technology and the kind of replacement of one technology with another. And this is a still, from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but there's this kind of famous quote from Hugo's novel, which is, "This will kill that." And there's always this idea that one technology completely eradicates and displaces another. And of course, this is from the movie rather than the book, so one could say that the movie killed the book. But of course, that's not the case, though we always imagine there's a kind of complete disappearance of one technology. And there are many people in the audience who will remember this Super Bowl commercial from 1983, done by Ridley Scott. And again, it's this kind of prediction that the monolith of IBM will be replaced by Mac. And there's a Olympian running down the aisle and then shatters the screen of Big Brother. But of course, that didn't happen 30 years later, though of course we've seen a kind of rapid change in the past 15 years in what technology is and how it appears. I'm now the director at ICP, which is a museum that deals with this last 175 years of image making, of reproduced images, of photography. And so we think in that field about the tensions between mechanical reproduction, between technology and between the hand. And so there's this kind of wonderful series by the painter Gerhard Richter, which present Polaroids, this great fascinating immediate producer of images, and these squeegees, really kind of tactile, physical, kind of paint applied over the surface. And for me, it sort of talks about this kind of moment where, again, we question the relationship between hand and physical making and technology. This work by it's actually a portrait, the black and white of Lyle Ashton Harris, but it's done by the painter Chuck Close. It's associated with doing gridded work, but painting, but this is a daguerreotype. And then the far slide is Lyle Ashton Harris, again, the photographer, dealing with issues of global technology within his own work. This was produced in Nigeria and then shown globally in the physical space of the museum. And so we think about physical space, certainly a couple of years ago with Occupy. Many of you remember Michael Kimmelman's story in the Times, and for someone who is trained as an architect, the centrality of physical space in that story, the polis, the ability to display your publicness in a space was critical, but again, it was amplified, so it was sort of, to the barricades, but tethered and really enriched by the ability to tweet and to gather people at a physical site. So it's a kind of complex interaction, and so this idea that somehow technology, the ability to stay in the comfort of your own environment and receive information, is in fact thwarted by this very old and persistent need that we have to be seen. So this is the Garnier Opera House. The spectacle on view, really, in the front of the theater are the theatergoers themselves. So you can see the royal procession going up the stairs, and then viewers not looking at the stage, but looking at the staircase, which becomes the central event. And so this vibration between the physicality of the thing, whether it's the artifact in the museum or the space, is something which is resonant, certainly when we talk about immersive environments. This is Las Vegas, you know, the place of forgetting. I think this is an Elvis store in the new city center. So the building, the interior space, becomes a backdrop for projection, and it becomes a place of commerce and a place to be seen. The very question about what you do with this very 19th century notion of a museum, that there are a set of privileged objects that are collected in a certain space, is in fact questioned by technology, which allows a vast kind of democratization of the image and a dissemination of the image. But again, this Barbara Kruger piece at the Wexner Center, questioning, why are you here? Is it about the art? Is it about the act of being social that draws you to the space? Like this Thomas Struth, which has, again, the students learning and learning within a traditional gallery space. They become the subject of the image, this fantastic image of Las Meninas. So at ICP, we think about what it means to interrogate the image. We're doing a series of symposia which will inquire about the photograph. Is the photograph a physical thing? Is it an object? Is it digital? How does this behave on the global stage? And then, in fact, what is an archive? An archive is certainly a collection of things, but increasingly digitized, increasingly available in multiple ways. And this affects the kinds of things we collect, certainly. It also has an impact on the way artists work. Here, the artist who's going to be in our upcoming triennial, Mishka Henner, who's looking at Google shots of Holland, but those kind of pixelated areas are all of the emplacements which are not allowed to be viewed. So it's sort of like, you know, doing a Google shot of the state of Nevada, you know, and like sort of 3/4 of it is blurred out because it's a kind of military emplacement. But we still use very, very traditional means, these images of sleeping soldiers by the photojournalist Tim Hetherington, which are up in our space and begin to engage the space of the street with images at multiple scales, so both billboard and also kind of museum without walls. We think as well about the immersive environment. We have an archive which dates back to the 1830s, the beginnings of photography, going up to the current era. And we recently had an event at the museum, and the charge to the designers, this was done by Leung and Leung, was to make an immersive environment, sort of like Kiesler's proposal for the 8th Street Cinema, where you would actually walk into the movie and images would be shown on the four walls as well as the ceiling. What we had done was tracked the arc of our collection, which is largest in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, and throughout the evening, you would see these images all tracked online from our archives, projected throughout the space of the museum, and then midway through the evening, these images went from black and white to color, sort of like the Wizard of Oz, though we had no Glinda appear. And you could see that tracking both our collecting and the kinds of things that were going on in photography. Similarly, the interactivity, the interactive element that we've seen in the previous presentations by Seb and Jake. This is the artist Raphael Lozana Hemmer. And he was very interested in the way that we become familiar with the colors and the kind of pixelation, but of those early sort of Commodore computer screens, Pac-Man. And I don't know if it's visible from where you are, but there are little notations like Pantone. So when people pass in front of this screen, this will fill up the windows on the plaza across from our museum. People will see their physical presence translated into these colored blocks. I'd like to leave you just with a quote that Arthur Danto, in his remarkable book, The Transformation of the Commonplace, talks about the relationship between art and mere real things. And he quotes Plato very loosely, and he said, "Who would choose the appearance of a thing over the thing itself? In other words, who would settle for a picture of something if he or she could have it, as it were, in the flesh?" And so we see in this very, very active relationship between technology, the representation, the virtual experience of something, and the actual and the haptic, which jockey for our attention. And it seems both will be with us. Both are layered, and it's actually the tension between the two that expresses our inventiveness and our ability to communicate. Thank you.
Still here?
This is product placement.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank our panelists for all the really exceptional work that you're doing. It was a real privilege for me to just listen to your presentations, and I have the privilege of working with two of you on a regular basis, and I've known Mark for a long time, and I think that you're really working at the forefront of your field, and just want to thank you for doing really excellent work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I must confess, when I'm watching these presentations, I said I've been in the museum world for 30 years, and sometimes I feel like I'm beginning to be a little bit of a fuddy-duddy because of the ideas that they are bringing in, although it's very, very exciting today. And you know, for up until very, very recently, almost just a few days ago, it seemed like the collection was at the heart of what we did. You'd come into the museum, you would have your contemplative moment with great works of art, and then go home. And that is completely switched today. There are times when I almost wonder, what's the value of even having the collection? Where does that, what role does that play? And I'm wondering if you could each address that, actually.
Sure.
Well, having a collection.
Yeah.
It's interesting. We have two shows in the galleries now. One is the work of the photographer named Shim, and the other is the work of Roman Vishniak. Now, these are bodies of work that people know selectively. Vishniak is associated with the vanished world of Eastern European Jews, and Shim is mostly known for the work the photographs of the Spanish Civil War. What's interesting, these are mostly drawn from our collection, though of course in the 3 or 4 years that our curators have put into doing this work, they've done a lot of research and discovered things not only about the photographers that we didn't know or didn't focus on, but about the kind of arc of history. So in looking at the Vishniak work, it was fascinating to see a rereading of a body of work done by scholars. So having a collection, having an archive. You know, I always think the potential for cultural institutions is the level of interpretation that you can bring to materials. So I was talking to someone today about online education, and the course costs $10,000 to do if you have a teacher, but you can also access it. And he said, you know, that's marketing, that's fine. If you are that good an autodidact, you can just sit, look at the material, and teach yourself. But what you pay for is really the interpretation. And it seems to me that that's really the role of cultural institutions, is they help to create different narratives, and they give other ways in. That seems to me the best, really, of the work that both of you showed, is that it allowed me to understand work that was either remote, so I couldn't physically get there, or it allowed the kind of layering of time, or it allowed the kind of reflection of what a piece might have looked like in situ, as opposed to in the abstraction of the gallery. And again, those are all decisions that affect the narrative and the understanding of the artifact. So expanding your ability to communicate with an audience about what it is that you're showing. So,
yeah, I think the collection's incredibly important, and what has changed is that we have the opportunity now to work with the entire collection, or the collections at scale, rather than the small percentage that we can fit in our physical gallery spaces. And that's both an exciting and great opportunity, but it's also a challenging one, because we don't have the staff to curate the world. And I often say to our curators at work that the opportunity in a design sort of museum, which is connected to the network, is to curate all the world's collections. To actually have vitrines within the galleries that can show the things we don't have. That make sense in the stories with the things we do have. So the opportunities for storytelling are incredibly greater, but constraints have been useful for us to frame things in the past, and I think we're still trying to figure out the ways to tell stories at that scale.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're seeing now, and you were both commenting on this, is the way that archives become something that you can do something with. Used to be just like curators were sort of physically collecting them to tell a story with them, but now, of course, that is open in a participatory manner in lots of ways, both for the collection in the museum that you're physically in, but also all these other digitized archives. I mean, one thing that it also brings up is this just question about the sort of physical versus the digital. One sort of provocation thought experiment that I've thrown out to a number of curators is this type of a scenario. Imagine this scenario, that you could have a visitor comes into the museum and they see a Jackson Pollock. They love the painting. It's incredible. In fact, they love it so much they go down, they immediately to the store, they buy a book on Jackson Pollock, and then they read the book and they love the book. Then they go on the website and there's all these awesome videos. They're watching all these videos, and then they see the movie, and then maybe it's like visiting some biographical house or other places, etc. Never goes back and sees the painting again. Now, is this a good visitor to a museum? Is this what you want? Is this what you aspire to? Isn't that arguably something that you want? In fact, he's such a lover of Jackson Pollock, he never goes and sees it again. He just talks about Jackson Pollock all the time. He doesn't have any need to see that. I mean, that's just a painting. Jackson Pollock is so much more than that. That's just like a mark in time. You have to see these photos. You have to see the videos of him doing the painting, the dance. That's really where it's at, right? So the question is, and it's kind of a conceptual art question. It's exactly what conceptual art itself posed to the audience. Like, where is the artwork? Is it the idea? Is it the biography? Is it the experience? Is it in our heads? Is it in the conversation that we have about the artwork? Is it really just about that physical lump of acrylic or glass that's sitting there inert in front of us? Or is it really about the life that sort of surrounds it? Again, this is a thought experiment because I work in museums and they're filled with beautiful physical archives, and I love them, and the fact that they are physical also does something to our brains. There's something very, very real about that. And there are amazing and many, many, many amazing studies that basically show that people just don't learn or engage in the same way from mediated interfaces that they do from actual physical connections, right? Like that, I think, for people who work in technology is sort of a foregone conclusion that, exactly as you're saying, the online classes are actually quite different than being in the physical classes themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think around that, I think that's one of the things we're tackling at work at the moment is we have this building that wasn't designed to be a museum. It became a museum building, and yet now we want those objects in our collection to do different things, and the building no longer suits what it was for.
Yeah.
I don't think any museum building really does anymore, because it's never, they haven't been redesigned for the affordances that now technology brings.
But it's also interesting going back to this notion of how we know we're looking at the real thing.
Right.
So authenticity, realness, it becomes an issue, and so you think about valuation. So painting is a single one-off. It has value. I can't tell you the number of people who say, well, photography, can't you just print more? So why do you pay money for this? You know? And it's an interesting question about value. If I look at a really, really good inkjet print of a silver gelatin photograph, unless you're remarkable and can look at paper types and are going with a kind of very, very close eye, it's difficult to tell the difference. And is your experience different? Is your experience of the artist's intent, the moment, can you have a kind of frisson of experience in front of that thing? And so that's an open question. On the other hand, as a scholar or watching scholars with primary materials, when we have as someone who's a Hollywood director come in and they're doing work on the Spanish Civil War and they want to actually look at Robert Capa's notebooks, and he puts on white gloves and he'll look at the actual negatives, there is a quality of engagement with the thing which is actually quite remarkable and unique and very different than seeing that projected or seeing that in a book. Yeah. So it's interesting, What
happens when that comes off the screen, though? So what happens when we have technology, say with 3D printing, or as you mentioned, high-end printing of photography? When that becomes physical, when the interface that the scholar uses for the digital materials is not a screen but a physical, another device or another medium that has a tactility to it, does that begin to question again the authenticity? Because the authenticity and the experience are wrapped up in the tactility.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's always kind of the fantasy that it leaps off the page, right? It's kind of like robotic interface, and it will be completely satisfying, right? So you have gloves and you have kind of devices on your eyes, and you can be thoroughly engaged, though it's all completely virtual. And so I don't know. You actually do have a real experience with a poster of the Guernica, and you do with a postcard, and you do with the real thing. And I think they're different, but you are getting information. So sort of going back to your question, Jake, about, is it A or is it B? Right. It's sort of, two mints in one. It is both of those things. It is, you are getting information, and so it's fabulous after you watch a movie on Netflix to be able to go on your iPhone and then research all of the bios of the people and figure out all of the movies they've done, basically to do kind of biblio searches about what you've just watched. I think it enriches the experience, but it's different from the viewing of the movie itself.
Right.
But a lot of this now one could actually do at home.
Sure.
Isn't it true that if a lot of it gets on, the museum puts it onto the web, that someone could do at home? And so why will people continue to go to museums? What's going to be unique about having the experience at the museum rather than...
I think it's the same reason people go to church and people go to school. Right?
To have the social...
the TV didn't kill church. Yeah. It tried like hell, right?
It became TV.
It tried really hard. It just, there is something electric that's wired in us to be physical and social. And I'll tell you about an amazing study. So Cleveland Clinic is obsessed with all these different statistics in terms of what helps people to heal in different ways. And they started noticing this really weird pattern with a specific type of surgery. People in this one building were recovering much, much faster, and like days faster than other people. And there was nothing statistical in terms of the actual cases themselves. So they were really puzzled by this, and they were like, well, what could it be? And they started noticing, actually, as the doctors, they switched to doctors, switched to nurses, switched to everything, And then they started looking at the physical space, and they're like, oh, that's so weird. Some of these spaces have windows, and some of these spaces don't. And they could actually predict the rate of healing based on the actual architecture itself. Yeah. But then they did something really interesting, because they're Cleveland Clinic and they're sort of obsessive compulsive about lots of ways to innovate. They were like, I got it, screens. We're going to put screens with the exact same view in these rooms without windows, right? And as you can imagine, no discernible difference. Meaning, to our brains, to something deep inside of us, that screen is like a wall, and there's nothing there, right? So Facebook and all these different apps are bringing in levels of connectivity and bringing in levels of communication, but in reality, yes, you're looking at a sheet of reflective glass, and that's what's there, right? And so part of, I think, what we're trying to do is figure out what can you do with that sheet of glass, and in other ways, how can that sheet of glass, like any other form of communication, like architecture, or like storytelling, or like filmmaking, make you more in touch with those physical objects when you're actually in the museum itself.
So I want, as a curator, I just wonder, trying to forecast into the future, how this might even impact our collecting. You know, if having a lot of the reproductions are an adequate surrogate for a lot of people, if maybe museums might not be spending some of the hundreds of thousands of dollars that they are in some works, and especially as you talk, Seb, about ways that museums, creating global museums so that we can dip into other museums' collections and still have access to their, like all the Picassos, for example. Right. And
yeah, I mean, one thing I've always been kind of interested in, coming from science museum world, is, now I can go to the art auction websites and I can see the prices. I was on one the other day just watching like a stock market of prices of contemporary art. And I was wondering, somebody, a student, should just make an app using the visual recognition that Cleveland used or other museums have used, that shows the price of art, of that piece of art or that artist as you're walking around the museum, because that porous border between the market and the museum is really a grey area, and then you start to reveal what do we actually value, how do museums make judgments of taste, and how are those asserted, and how do others play in that space too. It'd be very interesting to see.
It's interesting. It sounds like the Hans Haacke piece, which always. It was proposed for the Guggenheim and then pulled. Talked about the kind of provenance of certain works, or or who owned real estate, and the connections between real estate and art ownership and power in New York. It's very, very interesting to diagram that. I actually think one of the powers of technology is it allows us to go deeper and to take a very different kind of cross-section through what we're experiencing.
Yep.
And so it's a little bit the call and response that we saw in the piece that you showed. It's the object itself and then the response to it. Yep. So it's a two-shot.
That's exactly right.
And you get that in the same gallery space, which is very, very interesting. And I think this goes back to Cara's question, why we continue to go out.
And
it's because we do like to be seen. We do like the promenade. Think about going to a suburban movie theater. Why do you do that? They're just basically kind of god-awful boxes. But you do this, and what's become kind of the experience is people will go an hour beforehand, and there are arcade games, and people hang out, and there are cafes, and it becomes a social space, and especially in areas which have not so much place to be with other people. Right? This is why you do it, instead of waiting the 3 weeks till it goes on video.
Right.
But it's also scale. I mean, the cinema is also about scale. Sure. It's about the size. And I think, we've seen screen-based media change screen sizes so much, and the big screens are not really the thing anymore.
Right.
Yet, to see some of the works that we want to see, you actually do want to see them at their full scale.
For the Panavision of my youth, Lawrence of Arabia. Amazing.
I mean, I think that part of what you were talking about as well, in terms of that call and response, we've sort of gotten onto it. I have 2 young kids, and so I'm dealing with school and education, how kids learn, and what really engages them. And I find that when you look at kids and how they just sop up experience, and it really is by making stuff, right? There's Lego, there's engineering, there's blocks, there's erector sets, there's doll houses, it's playing, it's manipulating, and as adults, sort of taught to like walk through and like, you know, just ingest. And certainly my generation, as the TV generation, was in theory brought up to be completely passive, and yet, you know, you find people wanting to make things and wanting to do that sort of call and response, and in fact, learning and being more engaged by being able to access. It used to be, oh, the access is I can read the label. Oh, now the access is I can take the audio tour. And now the access is, well, forget, I'm just going to Google this and figure it out. That's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. And I can talk about that thing. And suddenly, the act of actually reaching out, of shaping my own interest in it, of projecting my point of view into the knowledge itself, whether it's an artist or a historic moment, that's actually going to help me map that onto my memory, onto my previous experience. Yeah. That's how we create knowledge and actually create wisdom itself. So if you have an artifact that jumps you into this huge experience, in this sort of roller coaster ride of you know, just learning and experiencing, if you can do that, you've done something really, really great. And it doesn't matter. I mean, I've done talks like this, and often I turn on the lights and ask people to show of hands about what they think, and some people are like, well, you know, you don't tell people to go see the object or look at the object. And I mean, part of, I think, our job is to make the objects so interesting that you have to go see them. Right? Like, I mean, to a certain extent, everybody, and us included, because I see people looking at their devices, it's a giant arms race for people's attention, right? Across the board. So you see TVs increasing their flicker rate and their nudity rate and everything else they can do to get your attention, and same thing with Twitter, and same thing with movies, and same thing with marketing, etc. It's a giant arms race for human capacity to focus on something. And within museums, I think people honestly pay big ticket prices to actually get away from that, to just be inside of a moment of meditation, and yet once they're there, they're filled with these questions. You know, why would we do that? Why would we do that? Why is that considered art? And the fact that museums are still trying to grapple with how to answer that, or starting to. I loved your comment that you remember the first meeting where you actually talked about the audience. Like, that's so amazing. And it's true, museums just weren't clinically set up to think about audiences. The audience was like a weird byproduct that just sort of showed up because they were like thinking about the artworks themselves.
Speaking of audience.
Yeah, speaking of audience, and speaking about audience participation, we've got a number of questions here. This is directed to Seb and others. Can you be more specific about how actual visitor experience interaction differs from that anticipated as determined through mobile tracking? And I guess that's about, how do you measure success? And then the other part, how can we ensure that digital devices, tools, etc., are resources for enhanced engagement rather than sources of distraction?
So the first part, when I was at Powerhouse, one of the last projects that I was doing with an exhibition there was tracking mobile use within the gallery, and looking at the way the interaction of visitors was with object labels and the amount, and matching that against the amount of time they spent in front of them. Now, usually that is done by having, you know, people who are poorly paid or never paid, you know, students following around visitors with a clipboard writing down. They stood for about 5 seconds, you know, all that. And they do about 30 people a day. We were tracking almost every visitor who had a cell phone in that exhibition every single day of the exhibition. So we had a very large sample size, and we could match the heat maps of the time visitors spent in front of works with what they did in front of them with the mobile app, and it started to create data that we could then bring back to curatorial staff and the editorial staff who were editing and writing the labels, to think about what are the things people, why does someone stand more in front of this and not that? Is it the work itself? Is it the interpretation? And it started to allow us to ask and do qualitative research to try and find that out. Because we know, you know, from all the audience studies that people do move through galleries much faster than the curators want them to. The education staff similarly. And yet we don't have good data about this. When you visit any museum now, and it's crowded, you know, what is the effect of the crowd? Should you have gallery limits? Should you make museums less crowded? How? do you do it by price? Do you do it by, you know, all these sorts of things? We don't have good data about the way people really behave within these physical spaces. And if we are redesigning them physically, as we are, we need the data.
That's interesting.
Just because I've got so many questions from the audience, why don't we jump to the next one? And actually, there's a stack of similar type of question. If technology is the future of museums, how do you bridge the gap between those adverse to technology and those using technology to engage new audiences?
I mean, that's the big challenge, or one of the big challenges. So at Gallery 1, the way that we achieved it was by pulling the technology away from the art objects and allowing people a traditional gallery experience or a mediated one depending on where they stood. And you could opt in or out. Different museums have very different opinions. We're also doing SF MoMA, and they are, you know, really in their own description, sort of a cathedral to modern art. It's like an incredible high church experience. And so they're very, very stringent about where and when technology gets utilized. So in some ways it's an institutional choice in terms of how they work together.
See, this one is, again, for Jake. Facial recognition, drawing, and play is so fascinating. What existing technology did you employ versus creating new program?
So all of our work is mixing together new opportunities that really engineering culture produces. So we are using a Microsoft Kinect, which is a 3D gaming sensor, to produce the body recognition. Or we're using a facial algorithm that was actually developed by an artist in Australia. That's open source, that we were able to leverage into that application. So I think it's really, I mean, and the question sort of points to this, it's about leveraging existing new technologies and thinking about creative ways to engage people towards them. And really what it points to, I think all of us, is the level of thoughtfulness and intent. What are you trying to do? If you're trying to make crazy pyrotechnics, there's a thing called trade shows, and it's really good for you to go out and to take the latest gizmos and shine in people's eyes and try and get them to pay attention for 45 seconds. In museums, we always talk about how technology ages, and the reality is technology ages poorly. Yep. Right? You will notice if the screens, like we made I was one of the original designers for biodiversity at the Museum of Natural History, first gallery to ever use touchscreens, and now they look like toaster ovens. They're hilarious. They're massive. Right? On the other hand, you still see people, old and young, clicking through them because the curators have really interesting things to say. So we always say, you know, if you're going to hire us to put gizmos in your galleries, you're going to be really disappointed. Like, we'll put stuff in, and yes, it will be innovative, and yes, that will develop buzz and press. The most important thing is that that actually goes beyond that, and that it works for visitors and creates emotional experiences. It connects them with stories, because that's actually what will age really, really well. Our first two pieces, StoryCorps and the orientation film for the Museum of City of New York, are still both going strong. Right? And they're going strong specifically because they're telling great stories.
I'm going to come back to that thought about the curatorial voice in a moment, but I've got another question that I'd love for Seb to address, because I know he's in the thick of it these days. Could you touch on the cost of these new technologies?
Yeah, it's expensive, but the cost is not, I mean, the cost is a capital cost. And the real cost is changing the workflows and the production environment to support the technologies, training the curators and inspiring the education staff and curators to use the technology consistently in new ways and use it as a platform to tell new kind of stories. If it isn't, it's a trade show experience, no matter how beautifully designed it is. The institution has to change with the technology. And I see this a lot with museums that source technology production. All of it is that they don't change. They outsource it just as if it's a marketing campaign. And when it's in kind of sourced or jointly developed, you have a much more transformational experience. And that's one of the things I think that's critical. I mean, it is hard though, because the initial capital cost is very high.
But I think his point, just underscoring this is happening with Cooper-Hewitt as well as all of our best clients, it's not just a collaboration between the head of IT or the technology person, it's about the curator, it's about the directors, it's about the voice of the museum. And the argument that we make is curators, instead, don't be afraid, not that you're necessarily afraid, but be excited We're going to do all these new tools for you to tell the stories. Like, we're giving you boxes to tell those stories that you really care. You're the people who care about those objects. And then you have all these other people who are coming in who also want to care about the objects, and we're just going to create that interface to connect those two things together.
But it's interesting because it's both about the way the museum operates, it's the space of the museum, but it's also the kinds of things we collect, and what we're actually displaying. So again, this earlier question of what goes inside of the box, right? And since everyone in this audience is looking at devices, my nephew is deep, deep into devices. How do we think about our approach critically to this kind of media saturation so that becomes part of our cultural narrative? So it's not as if what we collect goes up to sort of 1985 and then stuff that looks like the real world is owned by popular culture, and what goes in the museum is some kind of oddly rarefied, disconnected kind of piece. And so I think museums actually have to grapple with this, the way that we bring a different kind of curatorial eye and a kind of different narrative to the way people use standard kinds of devices, you know? Because technology moves so quickly and the marketplace is generally far ahead of cultural institutions, and we're generally left sort of collecting the artifacts years after they've been produced.
Well, there's also, I keep reading about the growing role of social curation, where the audience, where crowdsourcing is starting to become a way of doing exhibitions.
Well, there's we're in a weird moment in some ways, just to jump on what you were saying, where, like I had a very prominent curator pronounce that we are in this moment of unprecedented presentism. All people care about is just the present moment. Everything's happening all in real time, etc. And so in some ways, the burden has never been more important for museums to collect, right? Who's going to take care of this stuff and actually pay attention to it and make sure that future generations can, and simultaneously that the things that we're building are actually never been more fragile.
No, absolutely.
I mean, books just last.
Think about our archives. You know, so we are set up with climate control. It's pitched at a certain temperature, and it has to do with preserving works on paper or physical things. This is very, very different. I remember having to go back and resurrect a portfolio that I'd done only 10 years ago. I no longer had the software that could do it, and I didn't even have the hardware that would accept the floppies or the diskettes. Oh, sorry. I'm dating myself. Diskettes were little things.
And the bigger ones too. The
amazing. And so you have to kind of hunt around to find these. Forget 8-track. There's just. But because we generally don't have the kind of healthy distance and respect for the artifacts that we live with daily, and don't think about that, and that's why Cooper-Hewitt is such a phenomenal place, because it has the kind of thinking that, oh yeah, that broom is probably a well-designed or an interesting thing, not just something that's around, and so we should probably catalog it and put it somewhere, because eventually that will be 100 years old and viewed in a very, very different way, and will allow us to understand how culture was at a certain moment. And we're really not set up to do this cross-platform electronic saving and retrieval.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the object that we've just acquired for the collection, I was speaking to the registrars about, how do we put this in the system? And it's like, well, it's asking for dimensions. Well, it doesn't have a size, So it's counted in lines of code is the measure. But interestingly, to preserve it best, the registrar's like, well, maybe we should just print the code out in a scannable font, and the thing will actually be a ream of paper, archival paper, that actually does have a location on a shelf. I mean, otherwise the location is the internet.
So it makes you think about those space capsules where you have to assume what some other person in another world is going to understand, and come up with icons that will somehow be universally
literally universal.
Exactly. Understood. And so you think, how do you preserve meaning when it's encoded in a very, very specific way, and no one is really kind of saving the technology or the device that allows you to read it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I've grappled with this a bunch because particularly mentors who are older than me have expressed great depression over the fact that literally their works of art can no longer run. Like John Maeda has been acquired in MoMA, and he can't run his own software.
That's
right? So for me, I just have grown to accept that what I do is sort of like theater, but extended over maybe 5 or 10 years, but not over 100 years. And this weird, we are in this weird moment where, yes, everything we're making is instantly available, and it actually has this capacity to have impact like never before. I mean, it's phenomenal when you make something that catches fire, whether it's an individual tweet and you can watch hundreds and thousands of people retweeting it and talking about it and commenting back to you. I mean, there's a real energy there, and again, that's palpable and new. But all of that sort of presentism is also bedeviled in some ways by the fact that we're going to make this stuff and it'll be gone.
It's entirely ephemeral.
Yeah.
So it'd be fascinating to have this conversation in 5 years from now. See what we're saying.
Hopefully it'll be recorded.
Yeah.
Not on tape.
But maybe we should draw to a conclusion here by a comment or question we've received via Twitter. And I throw to all of you, is a museum dedicated to the future still a museum?
Definitely. Yeah. Museums should be about the future. They might use the past to inform the future.
That's right. My sense is you still travel to Rome so that you'll have some kind of understanding of, some kind of context. And it's the same reason we have archives. Because the reason that you can think abstractly about what we might be doing in the future is you have some understanding of a kind of history of ideas. Because essentially this is about communication. And so whether something is made with the hands, whether you're an architect who's actually drawing with a pencil, or whether you're doing something with Photoshop, or whether you're working using a software from the aeronautics industry, it's about communicating some sort of idea. But those ideas, we still see Shakespeare because, people still fall in love and get knocked out and get broken hearts, and one imagines that will continue to happen.
I actually, for quite a while, the word archive just seemed like these dusty vaults, but I actually think that archives are going to be something that people are going to start to have a heyday with as we start to digitize them and make them much more accessible to the public. So I think in many ways we're just on the cusp of the information revolution and sharing. So
I was just going to ask, can we see the house lights up? I'd love to, just before we depart, because we have such
ask your question?
enticing audience who's obviously so interested in stuff. So can we just see a show of hands? How many people think that this stuff makes sense to you? Like, these are the museums of the future. These are the types of experiences you'd like to see more in museums. Go ahead, don't be shy.
Is this market research?
I'm just curious. And how many people are super skeptical and think this stuff is going to sort of harm people's experiences?
Can you take a middle ground?
Yes. Well, you can raise your hand twice.
I'm giving it either or choice.
Yeah.
And the answer is somewhere down the middle. It's up to how well you do it, whether or not it has any meaning or it's meaningless.
Right.
Yeah. You're simply saying that the tool, it's not the tool, it's
right.
how you use it.
Yeah. Well, this was the question about distraction that I thought was really interesting, because to a certain extent, no, you can't design interfaces that aren't distracting. That genie has sort of come out of the bottle, but you can help to sort of compete beyond the distraction itself. I mean, that's the reality, is that all of these things are vying for your attention, but if you're really doing your job right, and that's everything from the sort of high church of SF MoMA to the potentially very, very participatory nature of the future of Cooper-Hewitt, I mean, you're engaging people deeply in the ideas and the experiences themselves.
Thank you very much. Cool. See you at the museum.